So my name is Maitreyabandhu, and here I am in the main shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre. And what you're going to be hearing is this wonderful conversation I had with the American poet and classicist and a translator and critic Stallings, Alicia Stallings. We talked about rhyme and why rhyme is so important to her. We talked about living in Greece, and we talked about the worst refugee crisis since World War II. So tune into this really wonderful conversation where Stallings talks about her life and writing and reads many of her poems. I hope you enjoy it. So welcome, Alicia. Really good that you can come all the way from Greece.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be in this PoetryEast and the Buddhist Center, and I wish more poetry readings started with that lovely meditation.
That's brilliant. So let's. I thought before we sort of say anything, really, let's start with that. I've been cheeky enough to choose the poems that I've asked Alicia to read, and I thought let's start with that first poem that I asked you to read, one called "Visiting a Class on Zoom," to talk about. It's a very contemporary poem.
Yes, I was invited by Rachel Hoddes, a friend of mine, to Zoom into her class. They were talking about the Odyssey, and they were talking about the Nakia in the Odyssey in Book 11, which is when Odysseus goes down into the underworld and talks to all these people that we've met in the Iliad. So it's a wonderful sequel moment. But it also seemed quite appropriate for a Zoom class because we're all kind of shades in the Zoom class in our little squares talking to each other. So. Visiting a class on Zoom to talk about the Nakia in the Odyssey, Book 11. A ghost among the ghosts who meet on Zoom. I am the guide, and I must read the room, explaining the underworld to these fresh shades, unwedded youths and newly sorrowed maids, a glass in hand, the sanguine hue of blood. I hope my speaking will be understood, describing what in Hades may be seen, distanced and virtual as on a screen. First Elpenor, hazed frat boy on a souse, who tumbled from the roof of Animal House. And always someone's mother's sacrifice has ended here. You'll try to hug her thrice. Here's Agamemnon, phantom who is haunted. He did not get the welcome home he wanted. And there's Achilles, buried with such glory, who'd rather be alive without the story. Better to be a nobody instead of somebody among the flimsy dead. He strives off, beaming though, in a long lope. News of his son thriving above brings hope. It's time to log off now, as ghosts swarm thick in sums confounding our arithmetic. When last of all, the friend steps from the throng, we owe atonement for an ancient wrong. That Ajax, frowning, hulking like a brute, whose huge resentment no one can unmute.
That's great, thank you. I was really struck by that when I heard you read it. I think on a YouTube Zoom thing. So I wanted to just first of all I use that as a way of talking about. You studied classics. You've translated Lucretius into rhyming 14ers and Hesiod. I think it took you 10.5 years to translate Lucretius. I wonder whether you say a bit about how you come to study classics and to do those translations, really.
Yes, I came to classics and translation, I think, through my interest in poetry, really. I was supposed to be majoring in English and music, and at that time, the English departments in the US, I don't know about here, were very focused on theory, and I really was interested in the nuts and bolts of literature and how it worked. And so little by little, I ended up taking more and more classics classes. This is how you can do this in the States at university. And eventually someone said, you realize you're taking all of this Latin and so on, you really should switch. And around the same time, I was in a advanced Catullus seminar, and I think for one of our assessments, you had a choice of writing original Latin meter in hendecasyllabic verse or doing a poetic translation. And the poetic translation seemed to be a much, much easier option. And then my professor was very pleased with it, and it went on to get published. And I realized, that this was something that I could do also that sort of exercises the same muscles and everything as writing my own verse, but is also a way to not be yourself and not have your own voice, to try on other voices and learn other things. So translation is a wonderful thing to have if you're a poet. You're not always facing the blank page and saying, am I going to be a genius today? You can sit down and do your 20 lines and be happy with that. So that's, I think, very, very helpful.
And what brought you to doing the Lucretius?
The Lucretius, I had been studying Virgil in my master's degree, and my professor, my tutor, Richard Jenkins, kept pointing out that many of the things I was interested in Virgil were from Lucretius, and it just became clear I needed to focus more on Lucretius. And I translated some, just sort of for fun to see what it would be like, and then I was commissioned to finish the whole thing with Penguin Classics. I think if I had really understood how much work and how many years were involved in it, I probably would not have had the courage to do it, but luckily I was ignorant, and I just sort of dove in and kept swimming until I got to the end.
The other thing I wanted to, we'll come on to another poem in a minute, but another thing I wanted to ask you about is one of the themes of your work is the underworld. It runs through all of the, not all of the poems, but I see it again and again as a preoccupation. Is there anything you could say about that?
Yes, I think it is certainly true. And in fact, my selected poems is going to be called This Afterlife, so it continues to be true. I think part of it is the underworld. If you're looking at a little bit, it's the case in Homer, but more so in Virgil, and then more so in Dante. It is a place of sorrow and various things, but it's also a place of unleashed imagination. You can invent punishments, or you can invent, have people tell their stories after the fact. I think I used to answer this question. I said, it's about death, or then later I decided it was about depression. And then at one point I realized I had lived for years and years in basement apartments, and I was looking at the world from that vantage point, seeing feet walking by and hearing things under the ground. I think it's all of these things, and I've also realized that there are other stories that I kind of consider to be like a catabasis going down into the underworld. I think Alice in Wonderland is that also, where she goes down to this topsy-turvy world and has these interesting conversations with people and so on. So I think I'm attracted to it partly because there are no rules. You can kind of make up your own underworld. And, partly I think poets are attracted to the morbid and the melancholy, and somehow attracted to it. How can I explain it?
It's a sad form, isn't it, poetry? But let's hear another poem from Olives, the title poem from Olives. So let's hear more.
Olives. Sometimes a craving comes for salt, not sweet, for fruits that you can eat only if pickled in a vat of tears, a rich and dark and indehiscent meat clinging tightly to the pit, on spears of toothpicks maybe, drowned beneath a tide of vodka and vermouth, rocking at the bottom of a wide, shallow, long-stemmed glass, and gentrified, or rustic, on a plate cracked like a tooth, a miscellany of the humble hues eponymously drab, brown greens and purple browns, the blacks and blues that chart the slow chromatics of a bruise, washed down with swigs of barrel wine that stab the palate with pine sharpness. They recall the harvest and its toil, the nets spread under silver trees that foil the blue glass of the heavens in the fall, daylight packed in treasuries of oil, paradigmatic summers that decline like singular archaic nouns, the troops of hours in retreat. These fruits are mine, small bitter droops, full of the golden past and cured in brine.
That's wonderful. I wondered whether this, I don't know whether this is right, but I wondered whether is this a manifesto of a kind?
Yeah, I think it works as a ars poetica of sorts, as do probably about half the poems. But yes, I think it is trying to be in that mode.
So I thought you talk about small because often. I mean, I was going to get you to read one of your long poems here, Lost and Found, but I don't think we've got time. But most of your poems don't go over the page, so you could describe them in a certain sense as small. Salt, not sweet. I wondered about that, and I thought we could talk about your golden past as well. It'd be good to sort of tell us where, tell us about your childhood.
Well, I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, which is a small city that's been absorbed into Atlanta, but when I was growing up was a very heavily wooded kind of suburban area. Very much Stranger Things, if anyone's watched that. That was sort of like my childhood, without the monsters, or maybe with the monsters. I had a childhood which my father, who was a professor at Georgia State University, was also a big outdoors person. So I grew up, fishing and running through the woods and finding arrowheads and things of that sort. And I studied classics, or came to study classics in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia, and later did a degree in Oxford and ended up in Athens, Greece. So sort of overdetermined. Athens to Athens. I will live in places named Athens, apparently. So,
And you said your father was a professor of...
he was in the education department and mostly taught statistics, but he was a great reader, and so he both loved hunting and fishing, and Hank Williams, but also loved opera and novels, and was always reading some huge brick of a 19th century novel. So I kind of grew up in that kind of mixed environment. My mother was a school librarian, so books were very much part of
your life.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. So let's carry on with possibly a statement of intent, which is the two violins.
Yes, another one.
In a way, it seems like another one, doesn't it?
Two violins. Two violins. One was fire red, hand-carved and new. The local maker pried the wood from a torn-down church's pew, the devil's instrument, wrenched from the house of God. It answered merrily and clear, though my fingering was flawed. Bright and sharp as a young wine, they said, but it would mellow, and that I would grow into it. The other one was yellow, and nicked down at the chin, a varnish of Baltic amber, a one-piece back of tiger maple, and a low, dark timbre. A century old, they said. Its sound will never change. Rich and deep on G and D, thin on the upper range. And how it came from the old world was anybody's guess. Light as an exile's suitcase, a belly of emptiness. That was the one I chose, not the one of flame, and teachers turned in their practiced hands to see whence the sad notes came.
So tell us something about that violin, and because it seems, one of the things that we'll come on to is form in your work, because the striking use of rhyme and meter in most of the poems that I've read. I've hardly read anything in free verse, for instance, and I wonder whether that was you thinking about the past in this poem. The great tradition, perhaps sort of see whether we
I mean, I think on one level, it's just a true story. I'm being taken to this, actually, my grandfather, and being taken to a fiddle maker in Kentucky, who's a very fine fiddle maker. And you know, I was looking for a new violin. I was studying violin. And I couldn't choose any of these violins. And I ended up, you know, much to everyone's surprise, choosing this quite old violin that's, you know, does have this wonderful, rich, deep sound, and is maybe less glamorous, but a better violin in some ways. But obviously, then it comes to speak for something else, and you realize later, oh, you know, this is maybe something about my choices in art, and I'm choosing these received forms and the tradition and you know, all that goes along with that. So. And I think it's also maybe something about being, you know, an American poet who's grown up in the South, and you know, this sort of maybe conscious alignment with some aspects of the old world tradition, and but maybe also being aware. I mean, I like that I have the devil's instrument in there, and that's the wonderful thing about poetry is even when you make a choice or there's a negative, you know, that I don't choose the fiddle, but it's still there. That's what I love about negatives is that when you write them down or you compose with them, you get to have both. You get to have both that violins are in there. It's why it's called two violins. It's not called one violin.
And I thought we'd talk more a bit here about form. You've got this wonderful Presto Manifesto, which I was very struck by. One of the things you say, for instance, is that rhymes are not good Victorian children, to be seen but not heard. Rhyme may be feminine or masculine, but not neuter. And then later, another one you say, rhymes do not need to be hidden or disguised. They are nothing to be ashamed of.
People love rhyme, in my experience. Kids love rhyme. I think something happens when people learn to unlove rhyme or decide that they're too sophisticated for it, or that it is somehow, you know, not intellectual, or it represents something backwards or regressive. But I think we love the sound of rhyme, and you know, in reviews of my work, there's often a kind of negative comment about the rhymes, like this would be a good poem if it didn't rhyme, or you know, if only. And I think it's a misunderstanding of how rhyme works. For me, rhyme is a compositional method. You know, I find out what I'm going to say by how the rhymes are working, and they lead me down a path or not. It's not that I compose the poem, the idea of the poem, and I put it into rhyme. I discover what the idea of the poem is, you know, through that sort of sounding board of rhyme. So I think rhyme gets a bad rap, as it were, and I think it is fun. And I was asked to do a manifesto, and for Poetry Magazine, and there were a number of people were asked to do manifestos, and I thought, oh gosh, I don't know if I'm a manifesto-y person. And then I thought, you know, I do feel this strongly about rhyme, and it was fun to do, because then I got to say a lot of fun things about rhyme, but some serious things that I feel about rhyme. When, you know, people will praise a rhyme, they're like, oh, I didn't even notice it rhymed, isn't that marvelous? And I thought, well, maybe. Or, you know, I couldn't even hear it, as if it's just something embarrassing. And I you know, people say, they'll complain, they say, oh, this is rhyme driven. I'm like, good. The rhyme should be the driver. If it's not the driver, it's an ornament. I want it to drive. So.
You even say rhyme frees a poet from what he wants to say.
That's right.
So say more about that.
Well, I think rhyme gives you permission to say things. You know, you'll come across something and you'll think, I would not have written that if the rhyme hadn't given me permission to do it. And because, you know, the rhyme then becomes the reason. Clearly the line has other reasons for being, but the rhyme gives that little seal of permission. You say, well, it rhymes, you know, it's fun.
Indeed. I mean, is it linked, because earlier on you were saying, you know, when you were going to study, you know, literature has become very theory-based. when I first started writing, I was struck by how poetry wanted to be an academic subject almost, something studyable. It's changed again now, I think, but I was very struck by that, people like Geoffrey Hill and so on. Is there in your use of rhyme a sort of critique of that, sort of theory-based? Because rhyme always, I mean, you're one of the major poets, I think, who've written about children. And children just instinctively love rhyme. I remember with Alex, my partner's daughter, singing Frère Jacques when she was 3, and she was just entranced by the patterning of it. She couldn't understand it, but she was entranced by it. And I wonder whether we sort of feel that we need to put that behind us in some weird way.
I think it's almost a sort of Protestant or some sort of resistance of pleasure. There's some sort of, there's a it's pleasurable, so it must be wrong or anti-intellectual or childlike. So I think there is in some branches of English literature a kind of suspicion of certain pleasures, and obviously there can be rhyme that is badly done, and that will stand out. That will be the thing that stands out in the poem. If you write a bad poem and there are bad rhymes in the poem, people will focus on the bad rhymes. But if there are bad rhymes in the poem, it's because it's a bad poem. I mean, that's, for me, rhymes, when they don't work and they clunk along, and you think about maybe The Cat in the Hat or kind of rhymes, although I like a lot of Dr. Seuss. But often when something is clunky and it's rhyming, it's because the syntax is very basic, and so you're rhyming the same parts of speech over and over again. You get noun, 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 noun. And so the problem isn't really that you get cat, hat, mat, bat. It's that you have these sentences that are just very stunted and sort of just, are ending all in the same way. So I think, I can look at just the rhymes of a poem and almost know if this is going to be an interesting or sophisticated poem, because it will be rhymes across parts of speech. It will be rhymed short words with longer words, abstract with concrete. If I see a lot of variation in that, then I think these are going to be interesting sentences that are crossing over the lines, and the rhymes are falling in interesting places.
You even say, I keep going back to your manifesto, you said there are no tired rhymes, there are no forbidden rhymes. Rhymes are not predictable unless the lines are. Death and breath, womb and tomb, love and of, moon, spoon, June, all still have great poems ahead of them. I really like that.
Because people are like, oh, you can't rhyme that, or you can only rhyme breath and death once, Yes, there are like pairs like that, like womb and tomb in English, and each language has its own groups, that maybe you want to be careful with them, but maybe it's because that's just like a big idea. But really, I think Frost talks about this also, that, if you have moon, June, spoon, it's really, that's just one little sound at the end. If you have, a phrase that goes with that is different from other moon, spoon, June poems, then, you'll have something new, I think.
Let's hear, because it's not you rhyme also in unusual ways. I wanted to get you to read the elder sister to Psyche, spoken in her voice. And this is a mirror form, I think, that, anyway, I'll leave you to read it, and then perhaps we can explore the form.
Yes, so I wrote a few poems about the myth of Psyche, of Eros and Psyche, or Cupid and Psyche, which is basically sort of ancient version of Beauty and the Beast, where there's this beautiful girl and she's married to an invisible prince in a palace where the food serves itself, and invisible musicians exist and so forth. Very Beauty and the Beast. And of course, her sisters or stepsisters, I forget what they are seething with jealousy. And they come to her one day and they say, so, this invisible guy that you've married, and I can see that you're pregnant. How do you know this baby isn't going to be a monster? I mean, you haven't seen this guy. And the one thing she's promised to do is to not ever, expose or look at her husband. But of course, she's tempted to do this because she becomes very afraid that she's going to have some kind of monstrous baby, and then she has problems with her problematic Greek mother-in-law, Aphrodite. But that's another part of the story. So, and I do write a lot about Greek myth, but I also write a lot about fairy tales. And for me, again, there is no difference between writing about a Greek myth or a fairy tale, or between writing about the underworld or Wonderland. To me, they're all the same. So this is one of these wicked sisters speaking to Psyche, and it is a mirror form. So I think it's 2 16-line sonnety stanzas. One starts with hands and ends with stings, and the other starts with stings and ends with hands. But it's mirrored, the whole lines are mirrored, so all of the lines will repeat backwards. I'll maybe raise my hand when we start going back the other way, so that you can see. I haven't read this poem in a very long time. This palace, those invisible hands that stroke the music from thin air, call it magic. Everywhere, the haunted rooms obey commands, and yet it sounds like loneliness. Yes, I'm that ugly sister, true. You'll say I only envy you. The fact, I know your secret guess. Surrendered blind to his embrace, you dared not look. A human voice, you thought, you never had a choice. Perhaps a monster, face to face, with scales and fangs and leathern wings. What of the fetus that you carry? For certain it is human? Very? Doubt burns like hot wax. It stings. Doubt burns. Like hot wax, it stings. For certain it is human. Very. What of the fetus that you carry, with scales and fangs and leathern wings, perhaps? A monster? Face to face, you thought you never had a choice. You dared not look. A human voice surrendered blind to his. Embrace the fact, I know your secret. Guess, you'll say I only envy you. Yes, I'm that ugly, sister true. And yet it sounds like loneliness. The haunted rooms, obey commands, call it magic. Everywhere that stroke the music from thin air, this palace, those invisible hands.
That's very, very wonderful. That's wonderful. So let's carry on with that. This is a short sequence, isn't it? We were just using both from Persephone to Psyche, which, again, you quite often do use great Greek myth and recast them in modern and contemporary settings, and this has got this.
So one of the adventures then, so Psyche then is sent on a bunch of impossible tasks by her wicked mother-in-law. And one of the things is that she has to go down to the underworld and get the box of makeup that Persephone has to make her always beautiful. This is always obviously a plan to kill her off. And it's also one of the things that really strikes me about this myth and why I think I was interested in writing about it. There are several figures that go down to the underworld and come back that are living, that go down and come back. There's Aeneas, Theseus is one. But Psyche is pregnant when she goes down to the underworld, and that to me, I think I was pregnant when I was thinking about these things, this very strange, liminal, I hate that word, but here it is, state of pregnancy, which is somewhere between birth and death, and the idea of a pregnant woman in the underworld who is alive really struck me. And I envisioned this conversation with Persephone. And this is a little bit like a sort of country song. Persephone to Psyche. Come sit with me here at the bar. Another Lethe for the bride. You're pregnant. Well, of course you are. Make that a virgin suicide. Me and my man, we try to spell a pharmacopoeia of charms, and yet, when I am lonesome, well, I rock the stillborns in my arms. This place is dead, a real dive. We're past all twists, rewards, and perils, but what the hell? We all arrive. Here, have some pomegranate arrows. I heard an old wives' tale above when I was a girl with a girl's treasure. The story went, soul married love, and they conceived and called her pleasure. In anhedonia, we take our bitters with hypnotic waters. The dawn's always about to break, but never does. We dream of daughters.
Yes, we're talking about daughters and children. I mean, one of the things that's really striking reading you is this mixture of ancient and modern, fairy tale and myth, and this wonderful writing about children. I can't think of another poet that writes so much about children. I don't know how your children feel about it. But let's. I wanted you to read pop music, which I thought was wonderful, and let's talk about that. It slightly changes tone.
Pop music for a new parent. The music that your son will listen to drive you mad has yet to be invented. Be assured, however, it is approaching from afar like the light of some Chaldean star. On what new instruments of torture, through what waves, lasers, wires, telepathy, the same banalities will play, systolic and diastolic as before, it's hard to say. As for the lyrics, or the lack thereof, about love or about the lack of love, despite the heart's reputed amputation, they will be as repetitive as sex without the imagination. The singers will appall you, yes, with their outlandish dress or lack of dress or excess hair or lack of hair, tattoos all aspects of their hygiene, because they remind you that he spends too many hours with hooligans called friends. And while you knit another ugly sweater, the pulsars of the brave new tunes will boom from the hormonal miasma of his room. Or maybe they'll just beam into his brain. Unheard melodies are better. Thus it has always been. Maybe that's why the sappy retro soundtrack of your youth ambushes you sometimes in a cafe at this almost safe distance, and you weep, or nearly weep, for all you knew of beauty or of truth.
That's just great, isn't it? That's really great.
That's my Grecian urn.
I really like the ghost of Keats walking into the poem at the end there. Say more about when did you start writing about children, and why do we not have more poems about children? You think?
I think there are a fair amount. Women can get into trouble writing about children. You get called a mommy poet. That was a thing for a while. That I was one of the mommy poets. For me, children are just a gift to a poet. Because first of all, before I had children, writing often about my childhood, and it's a way of re-entering that space to be a mother or parent of a child who's undergoing language acquisition, is to be constantly struck with wonder about language. A 4-year-old can be a sonneteer with both hands tied behind their back. I remember picking up my son from preschool when he was about 2.5 or 3. We're walking home. He turns to me and he says, "Who brings the night?" And then he says, "The witch." And I had to throw away a sonnet that I'd written that day because I realized it was nonsense. And they were also, because they were born in Greece and they're growing up in Greece, so they had the double thing of language acquisition in both languages and making some very interesting and strange connections. And I think a poet, is somebody who is stuck in language acquisition. They never got past that, where you're constantly... I think poets often take things very literally and then are sort of struck by, that's an odd phrase. It's certainly true if you're also then in another language, and, so that for a Greek to say, keep your eyes peeled, the Greek version of that is your eyes 14. And I was like, what? What is that? And so, I think having children, is a wonderful way of, not that you need to have them for this reason, but as a poet, I think it helps keep your wonder at language fresh, and you can steal from them. They have wonderful lines, and up until a certain age, you can just steal.
Let's have another. Let's have dinosaur fever, which again I really recognise.
Let's see. What page do I have that on? 50. This is another poem I haven't read in a very long time. It's very nice to have someone select some poems, because I think you get into a little bit of a rut where you read certain poems and you forget about other poems. In fact, the friend that I'm staying with in London is in the dedication of this poem. She is the daughter of a famous paleontologist. And anyone who has children in their lives knows that there's a phase around 4, 5, or 6 where they know everything about dinosaurs. Everything. Dinosaur fever. For Nicole, who was in a dinosaur book, and Jason, who would like to be. Dinosaur fever. They all get it. Kindergartners of either sex. It'll drive you crazy if you let it. Facts on Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, Iguanodon, Stegosaurus, always a classic. You must become an expert on all things Cretaceous or Jurassic. Tots tell you what things mean in Greek, in tones superior and mammalian. It seems they only just learned to speak, and now they speak sesquipedalian. I'm not talking Barney, all goofy and purple, chubby and bouncy and eager for school, but great scaly reptiles that bellow and hurple, a jaw full of daggers and bloody drool. They're better than dragons and fabulous creatures. Maybe a factor of their appeal is even the kindergarten teachers won't deny the brutes were real. Kids like their titanomachs gory, giants hurtling towards disaster, extinction as grim bedtime story, life getting smaller, smarter, faster. It's only a phase, this fad for fossil. Soon kids evolve to another stage, Barbie or Spider-Man, hardly colossal. Does something dawn on them at this age, some sudden awareness of time unsung, eons when monsters stalked the earth, how once even their parents were young in that vast prehistory to their birth?
That's great. That's really great. I mean, the one thing I want to draw out again here is the form. So it's an ABA rhyming, which is, it's very, very difficult to do. I always find that classic old-fashioned AB rhyming is very, very, very difficult to pull off. I don't know why, but it seems it's such a standard in a certain sense. It's very, very difficult to do. Can you say something about the rhyming in it?
Well, I think in this case, what page was I just on?
You were on 55.
Yes. So this one I was enjoying having a lot of really kind of complicated and fun rhymes. So one of the great things that rhymes can do is it sets up an expectation which you can then embrace or subvert. So you're kind of waiting like, oh, what's that going to rhyme with? And this is very brazen about that, I think partly because it's kind of like a children's poem. Right? So, get it, rhymes with let it, sex with Rex, Iguanodon, expert on classic Jurassic, so that was fun. Mammalian, sesquipedalian, purple with herple. Gotta give me some credit for that one. And creatures and teachers. But then at the end of the poem, when it sobers up a little, it has this little sober moment, then those rhymes are much simpler, unsung and young and earth and birth. So I think it would be a different poem if it rhymed on something kind of Byronically clever. But here it sort of wants to kind of calm down at the end, I think.
Yes, and you found it in rhyme, not... Because as you said, people sometimes think that one has a basic idea for a poem and then then makes it rhyme.
I
Or
think
did it come to you in
I
rhyme?
wanted to write about kids being obsessed with dinosaurs, and I suddenly realized there was a lot of fun words, and that's the fun thing I think for a 4-year-old about the dinosaurs is they love the big, long, complicated words. They're not afraid of it, and they'll know the etymology. They'll say, "Well, that means thunder lizard" or whatever, and so they're all little philologists at that stage, and I think they like being able to tell adults things that the adults don't know and use big words that the adults don't know. So I think that's part of the charm.
Yeah, indeed. So let's finish this first half with another poem. In the second half, we're going to have a cup of tea after this, and then in the second half, the mood will darken a bit.
As it always does.
Somehow a sort of sonnet form going on here. But yeah, let's finish with this poem. Again, it's in triplets, and it rhymes A, B, B, B. It's very, very difficult formed. Slightly Hardy. I mean, I was thinking of a Hardy reference for that. I don't know whether you had Hardy in your mind somewhere.
Well, he's a wonderful inventor of stanzas. I mean, I think he almost never repeats himself. It's startling when you start looking at all the wonderful structures of his poems. Yes, this is it rhymes A, B, 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 but it allows for more half rhymes and slant rhymes than some of the other poems, I think. And again, at another point in my life, I was doing a lot of music, and while I don't do so much music now, you do end up with wonderful vocabulary and references and things. So it's great to be a poet and fail at things because you can use them in your poem. So this is Listening to Peter and the Wolf with Jason, aged 3. Eyes wide open, grinning ear to ear, balanced between the thrill of fear and fear. He clutches at my skirt to keep me near and will not let me leave him by himself in the living room where Peter and the Wolf emerges from the speakers on the shelf. He likes Peter's jaunty swing of strings, the reedy waddle of the duck, the wings that flute up in the tree, but still he clings, even though for now it's just the cat picking its sneaky way through sharp and flat. He isn't frightened of a clarinet and laughs at grandfather's bluster and bassoon, but keeps his ear out for another tune at the shadowy edge of the wood and coming soon. Where is the wolf? He asks me every chance he gets, and I explain each circumstance, though it's not as if he's heard it only once. You'd think he'd know by now. Deep in the wood, or under the tree, or sent away for good to the zoo, I say, and think he's understood. And weary of the question and the classic, I ask him where the wolf is. With grave logic he answers me, the wolf is in the music. And so it is. Just then, out of the gloom, the cymbal menaces, the French horns loom, and the music is loose, the music's in the room.
That's really wonderful. So that's a great place to finish our first half, and then we'll have a cup of tea, and then come back and hear more in the second half. So thank you very much. Good. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some cake. It appeared, it was rather miraculous. It's almost like a gift for Alicia. There's this rather gorgeous cake that appeared in the room and said, "Eat me," written on top of it. So one had to take it by its word. So let's hope we've all eaten it. So we're going to start with this poem for a young Turkish violinist drowned on the Aegean crossing. It's just been published, I think, in the New York Review.
So this poem came out of 2017 came out of a news item. I live in Greece, and we've had a lot of refugees coming over from Turkey, and often, unfortunately, drowning on little dinghies and so forth. This one kind of struck me because of the nature of what was found, and I think the poem explains it. And I was able to find out the name of the violinist, so it's in memoriam Beres Yazgi. Reports said you were found clutching the case containing your instrument, as well as music of your own composition. You knew what it was to place faith in a hollow wooden vessel, carried on waves, lilting in harmonic motion, scales like water running through your fingers. I think of Arion of Lesbos and his harp, saved by a dolphin in the legend, of accidentals flat and sharp, of pitch and yaw. I think of the deep sound, of the bow rolling across arpeggios, no bridge but the violin's bridge.
Let's hear that again, I think. It's such a strong poem, and sometimes you just want to hear them again, don't you?
And there, for people that don't know about this, a Greek legend about a musician, Arion of Lesbos, who's captured by pirates and ends up overboard and is saved by a dolphin. This obviously didn't happen in this case, but since this violinist was found in the same waters, it reminded me of that legend. Reports said you were found clutching the case containing your instrument as well as music of your own composition. You knew what it was to place faith in a hollow wooden vessel, carried on waves, lilting in harmonic motion, scales like water running through your fingers. I think of Arion of Lesbos and his harp, saved by a dolphin in the legend, of accidentals flat and sharp, of pitch and yaw. I think of the deep sound, of the bow rolling across arpeggios, no bridge but the violin's bridge.
I mean, it's based, one of the things that we'll be exploring in this second half is your life in Greece. You've lived in Greece through very tumultuous years. That what is effectively has been said to be the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Estimated 1.3 million refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, flooding into Greece. I wonder whether you might say a bit more about that time, because you've been very involved in it directly.
You have to consider also that this refugee crisis is kind of the wrong word, because crisis suggests a sudden moment of judgment, and instead this has gone on and on. Similar to the economic crisis, which was not a crisis, but a decade-long depression, really. And one thing kind of went into the other thing. So, Greece was kind of roiling from other problems. And it became very suddenly visible in Athens around early in 2016, where ships were coming over from the islands, with people almost walking out of a war zone. I was involved with some volunteers who would go down to the port. We would meet the boats. There was nothing, Syriza, the coalition of the radical left, was then in charge of Greece, and for better or worse, offered sort of nothing official to refugees. They also didn't get in their way. And solidarity groups who had been helping the local population during the economic crisis sort of seamlessly moved into helping these new people who needed help. So there were already kind of groups in place, and the government sort of said, if you said, this building's not being used, we'd like to distribute things from this building, they were like, fine, that's fine. So, there were good and bad things about almost no governmental interference whatsoever. But we'd go down to the port, you would get the Facebook groups, and there'd be a list of, this boat is arriving from Lesbos with 500 Syrians, this boat is arriving at this time, and you'd go down, and I was with the group for a while distributing baby carriers, because at this point you could just walk up into Europe, so a baby carrier was very helpful because you were going to walk up to Germany, or apples or whatever it was, or welcoming people. Then in March of 2016, the borders with Europe suddenly shut, and suddenly people started kind of building up, and Piraeus became very rapidly a tent city of 5,000 refugees in almost no time. So that the problems kept changing and the challenges kept changing. Now for many years, actually since then, I've been running a sort of poetry workshop that maybe is a aspirational term, with refugee women mostly from Afghanistan, but also Syria, Iraq, various things. And I was involved with some of the irregular housing situations, some of the squats in central Athens. So it was a very, very interesting time, and to be kind of directly involved was, it felt like a kind of gift, because you were seeing all kinds of suffering in the world, and to be able to just go and help out and lend a hand and directly help people, I think is a privilege. And our group of people, we tended to be mothers who lived in the center, who had kids, so we gravitated towards entertaining the kids because that's what we did. We knew how to do that. We were almost all academics or artists or writers, and that was its own side thing. But also just this feeling around 2016. Also, there were a lot of drownings in like one day, and people were all upset about the Kurdish child whose image was all over, but I was seeing really horrific images every day. You wake up, put your kids on the bus, and open Facebook and realize that 37 children had drowned like in a single day. And, you just think that's like 2 classrooms, And there's also this kind of eerie sense that the Aegean, which has been seeing drownings since people have figured out how to get on the water, and these populations have been going back and forth since the Bronze Age and before. I mean, it's a highway. But this feeling when your kids are playing in the water, that water is also touching the other children. There's this feeling of connection in both time and physical space. So it's been a kind of intense and interesting time.
So let's hear some of the Aegean epigrams. Very, very strong, powerful work that you've been writing about them.
So one of the things, and there was a problem of how do you write about this without centering yourself and your own experience, because this is not my experience, and I don't want to take someone's experience, and how do you do that? And form has a way of giving yourself a bit of distance, allowing there to be some distance between yourself and the subject. And I really was very upset about particularly the drownings. And then I realized, there is already a form for that. What page is this on?
It's on 100 page.
Okay. It should work in this book because it's in alphabetical order, so it should really be very easy to find anything. There is already kind of a form for this, which is the epigram. And there are epigrams in the Greek anthology that are about drowning. So it seemed to me that the epigram was a way of putting a little bit of wit and distance into what is really just unbearable if you think about it. So this is in a larger... So I just started writing these little epigrams, and then I realized maybe I should just pile them all together. It has an epigraph. I guess get tongue-tied with that. Aegean epigrams, it has an epigraph from Aeschylus's Agamemnon. We beheld the Aegean blossoming with bodies. This is an important little snatch of Greek because George Seferis borrows it and uses it in a poem. And as these drownings were happening, the rector of the Aegean University on Mytilene in Lesbos quoted that line. So it's this ancient Greek that also becomes modern Greek and then was also responding to the current crisis. And there's that layer of Greek going through that. So we beheld the Aegean blossoming with bodies. And they each have little titles. Upon an unseaworthy wooden vessel. Call it a tub, call it a casket, and all their eggs tucked in this basket. The woman from Leros said, small bodies wash ashore, sea-chewed, a few days dead. I don't eat fish anymore. From an autopsy report of an unknown drowning victim in Icaria, And I know the person who did that autopsy. He's a doctor and a poet in Ikaria. Female, 9 years old, found wearing a blouse and a pair of sweatpants patched with Minnie Mouse. Duties. Which one seems more chilling? Copenhagen willing to confiscate cash and bauble from Mosul, Homs, and Kabul, or smugglers making a killing, palming Karen's obel. Fathomless. A fathom deep, the body lies, beyond all helps and harms. Unfathomable, unfathomable, the news repeats like charms, forgetting that to fathom is to hold within your arms. Word problem. The 21-foot-long dinghy can hold up to 30 people max if you squeeze on 64, wave a 9mm at their backs in 604, 2 nautical miles out into international waters. Which do you not say first? Infants, sons, mothers, fathers, daughters? Paradox. Of the ones that happen to die, the little ones and the old, by hypothermia or drowning, all died of cold. Nothing to declare. As if in a sea of red tape, the faulty life jackets tossed, there is no custom house, no guards at the border these have crossed. Proposed epitaph for drowned refugee children. Go tell the bureaucrats, passerby, that all is ship-shape, fine. The stuff that trickles from your eye is only a little brine. So that last one is also a nod to Simonides, and I kind of felt that these forms were ways to respond to the news in kind of real time, while not.
I mean, I can see that. How do you write? It's such a difficulty, isn't it? How do you write about those things without making use of someone else's trauma, which always seems to me disgraceful, but also not writing about them yourself being a mother and living there and having children that age would be impossible. And there are all sorts of ways that you've tried to do that, and it seems that form helps you do that.
I think, is it Adrian Rich who talks about form as the asbestos gloves with which you can handle, the toxic and nuclear material.
So, it just feels right just to have this poem, Empathy, which, I see what you think. I think it's a wonderful example of a standalone poem. Clive James says that the highest sort of criticism of the poem is the poem itself. The word poem, does it work as a poem? Does it work as a standalone work of art that doesn't reference? You don't need to know the author. You don't need to know where they're writing. You don't need to know anything about poetry. Whether it exists as a poem, and I personally thought this really was a very, very great example of that. Again, it's in rhyme, in ABBA rhyme, with this sense, and the ABBA rhyme, it tends to sort of, doesn't it? It steps you forward and pulls you back. So it's got this sort of instinct to try to move forward and to keep on being pulled back by that A rhyme. So you get A, then you get B, B taking you forward, then you get A coming back again, pulling you back to something again. And that seemed to me very important in this poem, that you've got that double movement of trying to move one way and being pulled back another. I don't know whether that's...
Yeah, I do like envelope rhyming that way, because it does subvert the expectation of ABAB, which is one of the things that rhyme can do, is that it's... And, if you can spill the syntax out of it sometimes, then that has its own way forward. So this poem is called Empathy, and it was really when I was struggling about how do I write about this, how do I not write about this, and I thought, why don't I write about that? So, Empathy. My love, I'm grateful tonight. Our listing bed isn't a raft, precariously adrift, as we dodge the Coast Guard light and clasp hold of a girl and a boy. I'm glad we didn't wake our kids in the thin hours to take not a thing, not a favorite toy, and didn't hand over our cash to one of the smuggling rackets that we didn't buy cheap life jackets no better than bright orange trash and less buoyant. I'm glad that the dark above us is not deeply twinned beneath us and moiled with wind, and we don't scan the sky for a mark, any mark that demarcates the shore as the dinghy starts taking on water. I'm glad that our 6-year-old daughter who can't swim is a foot off the floor in the bottom bunk, and our son with his broken arms high and dry, that the ceiling is not seeping sky with our journey but hardly begun. Empathy isn't generous, it's selfish. It's not being nice to say, I would pay any price not to be those who died to be us.
A really wonderful poem, I think. It's really wonderful. Let's carry on in this dark mood for a moment. I think in Robert Frost's last reading, I think he said, "Let me end on that dark note." But let's carry on with this dark note from it, and I'll get you to read the Spartan generals. Perhaps you might say a bit about the form as well. But
this came out. Actually, it was partly. There was a project. There was a film called "The Road to Sparta." A friend of mine who is a journalist, Barney Spender, did this film about this massive race that is beyond a marathon, and he wanted some poems for it, and I thought, well, I don't think I can write about poems for this, and then I suddenly realized I had been writing poems about this thing, and I had been looking at Herodotus, who is this wonderful Greek writer who maybe invents history. He's sometimes called the father of lies, but he's really the father of journalism is what he is, because this is after the Battle of Marathon and so forth, and the Persian Wars, and he interviews eyewitnesses. And, if he has more than one account of something, he'll give you both accounts, and, it's up to you to judge. It's not Thucydides who decides this is what happened. He'll say, well, I talked to this person, they said this, and I talked to that person, they said that. And it's just wonderful stories. And I suddenly realized, and this mopping up operation, the Battle of Plataea, which is basically the Greeks finally get rid of the Persians once and for all, but there's just marvelous stories throughout this section. And I thought, I just want to versify this, which is a kind of strange, not something I'm normally doing, but I thought, I want to make poems out of these prose anecdotes. So they are poems, but if you see them in the book, they look like prose paragraphs. Herodotus is also one of the very first people who writes prose that we know of, one of the very first people really composing in prose. So I like the fact they look like prose, but you can read them if you want to, like sonnets. In fact, I think a review in the New York Review of Books said, these very strange prose poems that sound sonnety. It's because they are sonnets. But be that as it may. So it's really just an actual anecdote straight out of Herodotus. I almost want to give you the anecdote and then read you the poem, but maybe I'll read you the poem and then I can give you the anecdote and I hope it is clear. So this is the Spartan generals. They have defeated the Persians and they go into the Persian tents. And as you'll know, the Spartans live a very Spartan life. They don't have luxury of any kind. And suddenly, they go into these Persian tents and see this gorgeous tapestries and elaborate food and beautiful dishes, and they're sort of, why did you come to Greece? You have all this stuff. After the blood-brimmed field, we were amazed to stride into those empty silken tents, bright tapestries, wrought silver ornaments, the furnishings of solid gold. Eyes glazed at all the untold booty. Gods be praised. Our king bid foreign cooks spare no expense to make the meal our foes would eat, prepare their pastries, spices, wine. Such slowly braised flesh melting off the bone, such colors, scents. Our king laughed as he laid out on the cloth beside the feast our ration of black broth. Behold, They came to rob us of our fare. We also laughed, though fed up with that food, the soldier's mess, the black broth of blood.
I mean, I want to carry on a little bit more in this dark mood, then we will sort of slightly come out of it. With this poem, Colony Collapse Disorder. And it is striking, there you are, Alyssa, living in Greece. You're a classics scholar, and there is this sense in your poetry of a sort of Greek. There's this. I want to talk about the positive. The positive. I don't mean in the wrong sense, but the warmer side of the poetry in a minute. But there is this sort of a sort of sense of Greek horror that lurks in the poems, in the underworld, in poem after poem, often just sort of a little bit of darkness sort of creeping into it. But there's this sort of, and this poem I thought was very strong in that the human capacity for violence and destruction and a despoiling of the world. I don't know whether you want to. It seems just so striking that you're living in Greece, translating Greek, and yet it seems natural to you as a person as well, this darker, sort of almost Greek tragic sense.
Well, I think sometimes I'm trying to figure out, as like with empathy, how to write about something. I think, all of us, I think, are very concerned about the human misuse and destruction of the world. Those of us who are parents are very concerned about what is coming, that our children will live through. Poets are very upset about bees. We love bees. And there are a lot of poems about, being concerned about bees. So I wanted to write a different kind of poem about being concerned about bees. And again, trying to find that kind of irony or distance where, there's a little bit of space between what you're saying and not just, I am very worried about bees and pollinators. And then I realized, there's this wonderful simile in the Iliad where the soldiers are likened unto a hive of bees, and from there I thought, yes, I think I can do something with that. And some of it is simply the use of the title. So it's Colony Collapse Disorder. So the climate anxiety is right up there. And then you have Iliad 2.87 to 2.90, and you can go read those lines, and it's the simile. And it starts off with a direct translation of the Greek, and then it takes a turn. Just as a swarm pours from a hollow rock in one long beeline for the wild time, alighting in clusters on this purple and that, but is stricken with a mass amnesia that disorients the compass of the sun, and they forget the steps to traditional dances, and each helicopters into a different dimness, taking their saddlebags of sweetness with them, and the hive goes dark. The queen is left to starve, and the drones humbug the whimper of the world, and the palace falls to ruins, broken into by vandals who would loot the golden stores left in the brittle wax hexameters, just so. And I'm obsessed with epic similes, so it was fun to write half of an epic simile.
Yes, I'm sure I want to say more about that. I'm very struck by that for some reason, that poem. Just so at the end, and the epic simile, and you managing to sort of again, it's this, you managing somehow to translate those forms which people easily feel that they're not relevant anymore, which of course they always are. All of these things are as relevant as they ever were. And you manage to somehow translate them into now, with the same feeling of tragic destruction.
Some people, I think, have discussed this poem and see it more as a concern for, because it's got, instead of the brittle wax hexagons, it's hexameters. And, the idea of traditional dances, and they think it's me bemoaning, something happening to poetry, which maybe it is also. I mean, I don't, say it doesn't mean those things, but I guess I was more concerned maybe about the bees themselves. But But there's a reason why I picked hexameters and not hexagons. So, as Frost says, if someone finds something in my poem, I take credit for that.
Quite right, too. So let's change the mood for this, Like the Sestina, which is again the title poem of Like. Like, by the way, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So, one of the striking things about the collection is, as you said, it's all in alphabetical order, which of course reminds me of James Merrill's The Book of Ephraim. But yeah, let's say a bit more about the form of the sestina. I like the joke on the sestina itself, but let's hear the poem first, and then.
If people know a sestina, it's a 39-line poem with 6 stanzas that will there's 6 words that end each line of each stanza, and then they kind of do this dance and this permutation. I'm sure there's a mathematical formula. And then there's 3 lines at the end where you have to get all 6 words in. So you're supposed to be listening for these 6 words coming up again in different permutations. So like the sestina, with a nod to Jonah Winter, and I'm actually nodding to a poem called Sestina Bob. And if you don't know this poem, Sestina Bob, I say go look it up, it's fun. Now we're all friends. There is no love but like. A semi-demi-goddess, something like a reality TV star look-alike named Simile or Me Too. So we like in order to be liked. It isn't like there's love or hate now. Even plain dislike is frowned on. There's no button for it. Like is something you can quantify. Each like you gather's almost something money-like, token of virtual support. Please like this page to stamp out hunger, and you'd like to end hunger and climate change alike. But it's unlikely like does diddly. Like just twiddles its unopposing thumbs up, likewise props up scarecrow silences. I'm like so over him, I overhear. But like he doesn't get it. Like, he's like, it's all okay. Like I don't even like him anymore. Whatever. I'm all like... Take like out of our chat, we'd all alike flounder, agape, gesticulating like a foreign film sans subtitles, fall like dumb phones to mooted desuetude. Unlike with other crutches, when we use like, we're not just buying time on credit. Like displaces other words, crowds cuckoo like endangered hatchlings from the nest. Click like if you're against extinction. Like is like invasive zebra mussels. It's like those nutria things or kudzu. Or belike redundant fast food franchises, each like more like the next. Those poets who dislike inversions, archaisms, who just like plain English as she spoke. Why isn't like there literally every other word? I'd like us just to admit that's what real speech is like. But as you like, my friend, yes, we're alike. How we pronounce, say, lichen and dislike cancer and war. So like this page, click like.
So great.
That came partly out of, so it's very common in poetry courses to be assigned a sestina, and they're usually awful. And the problem with the sestina, I realized, because I had taught them for years to people and made other people do them, and I didn't really write them myself because they're not really a very good form usually. I mean, there's some brilliant poems in the form, but a lot of sestinas are just churning their wheels. And I realized, and I had been teaching it, it's about obsession, because these words repeat. I realized, no, the problem with the poem is it is 39 lines long, and that's a page and a halfer. And, unless you have something that you can say for a page and a half, you do not have a sestina. and then I realized it's actually really easy to repeat words. If you're doing a narrative poem, if you're saying the 3 bears to someone, there are 6 words that are going to repeat very easily. You've got bear, you could have locks, Goldilocks, just right, these things, and they're just going to cut, and maybe you could be creative with bear or locks, but it really almost writes itself. So I realized that the problem was, you had to have a rant or you had to have something you wanted to say, and then I thought, I would just prove my point by just going with one word.
All of the key words are like. It's a wonderful joke on the sestina.
And in fact, I'd gotten so carried away, and Poetry Magazine accepted it, and then in proofs I realized I had an extra stanza. I'd gotten so carried away, and I had to cut a stanza. There was one too many.
So let's. I wanted to read this lovely poem for Atalanta, your daughter. As I say, one of the striking themes in your work is writing about children. You know, we heard pop music and dinosaur fever and listening to Peter and the Wolf. I don't think we should ever lose touch with childhood, really. I think one of the things poetry wants to do is keep touch with childhood, and as you say, with that language creation and with rhyme and with the simple beauty of rhyme. But let's hear Atalanta and then see what you might say about that.
So my son is named Jason. My daughter's named Atalanta. I'm sort of from Atlanta, I should add. And when my daughter was born, and we found out my mother in Atlanta, and she was very excited to hear the baby had been born early, as it happened. And she said, well, you know, she wanted to know what her name was, and said, we're going to name her Atalanta. And there was a pause. And she says, but what are you going to call her? Atalanta also had a spectacularly dramatic baptism, which is a whole other story. I think some people know it very well. Like the most dramatic baptism that has ever happened in the history of Greece, truly. For Atalanta. And I had this poem, for the baptism. I felt like I'm a poet. I have to, come up with a poem. Your name is long and difficult. I know. So many people whom we didn't ask have told us so. And taken us to task. You too perhaps will wonder as you grow and blame us with the venom of 13 for ruining your life. Using our own love against us keen as a double-bladed knife. Already I can picture the whole scene. How will we answer you? Yes, you were in a hurry to arrive, as if it were a race to be alive. We weighed the syllables, and they rang true. And we were hoping, too, you'd come to like the stories of princesses who weren't set on shelves like china figurines, not allegories, but girls whose glories included rescuing themselves, slaying their own monsters, running free but not running away. It might be rough, singled out for singularity, tough. Beauty will be of some help, you'll see. But it is not enough to be nimble, brave, or fleet. O apple of my eye, the world will drop many gilded baubles at your feet to break your stride. Don't look down, don't stoop to scoop them up. Don't stop.
That's great. And then I thought, let's get you to read this poem, Memorial. I mean, just perhaps before I say that, we've talked about this sort of dark theme in the work, but when having read the two collections, what I felt is that the deeper impulse is to celebrate. It felt to me to say yes and to find ways of saying yes, and in a certain sense, it's harder to say yes than to say no. Nowadays, it's very easy to say no, and it's easy to sort of do that. But I felt reading them that there's this deep urge to celebrate, and to celebrate I don't see what you think of it, to celebrate what I would call something like the everyday, the value of being a mother, listening, a child listening to Peter and the Wolf. Marriage, will come on to marriage, and a marriage going, not the hot romance of a marriage, but a working marriage with two actual people who are trying to make it work. It seems to me that your deepest sense, or at least how I read them, is to celebrate. I don't know whether that's what you would say.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think even when one is feeling very dark about things and there's a mood and a melancholy. I think the urge to write a poem is ultimately a positive urge, even if it comes out of melancholy or so forth. I mean, I feel that way, about Poe's Raven poem, which is just all this negatives, nevermore, 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 but then in this gorgeous rhyme, and so that almost cancels out the sort of nihilism or whatever. And I think that the sounds of poems, ultimately you're making something rather than nothing. So I would say maybe that's true.
So yeah, let's hear Memorial.
Memorial. Mnemosino. So this is in Greek death funeral culture. One of the things that you do is there's the funeral, but then there's a series of official memorials. I like this kind of rhythm of grieving. I think I know in America, and like the culture I was brought up in, it's you bury someone and you're supposed to move on, and I like that in Greece and the Orthodox church, and there are other cultures obviously that do this, but there's a 3-day, 7-day, 9-day, 40-day, 1 year, 3 year. It seems to go by some kind of organic rhythm of when the family kind of needs a bit of acknowledgement or support. So it's very important to do this, like this 1 year memorial. You have to go to the grave and do certain things. So this is one of those moments. You'd lost your father's grave. We wandered row by row and plot by plot. And it was hot. Under stiff cypress shade, the stillness drowned by a lone insect's corrugated sound. You went on ahead to inquire of the bureaucracy of the dead. Overdressed, uncomfortable as guilt, we stood around, not knowing how to behave. The kids began to wilt, and there was nowhere to sit that wasn't a tomb. Each grave was kitted out with a dustpan and a little broom to tidy the garden beds of the bereft. And here and there hung plastic watering cans chained to headstones and trees. Without a doubt, even in this place, there was a problem with theft. Then you came back with the coordinates and snagged a priest, glistening in polyester black, who at the grave, now found, spoke of the rest and rising of the dead, as if they were so many loaves of bread, tucked in their oblong pans in a kitchen gold with sunlight, rich with yeast.
So listen, I think we've just about got time for 2 more poems. It's just lovely to hear them. It's just so great to hear them. So I wanted to get you to read this poem, Swallows, because there was a few other poems I'd like to do, which are to do with marriage and to do with, as I say, a working marriage and trying to work on a marriage, and I don't know, a kind of graciousness and a generosity about that. But I thought this was one of the examples of it that I thought would you.
Someone has pointed out in interviews, you have a lot of poems about marital arguments. And I had to think about that, and it's true. And I think it's partly to do with an argument kind of puts you into that poetic frame of mind. You have to stand back and sort of think about what was said and what was changed, and you kind of go into that internal thing. So I guess, or strife is my muse is another. So this is about swallows, and it is about a seaside taverna that we have gone to a lot over the years. For those who are keeping track, I think it's an ottava rima, and in a shorter line, in a kind of 4-beat line. And we'll get the story of Ovid and the swallow and the nightingale in here too, but I think it explains as it goes along. Every year the swallows come and put their homestead in repair, and raise another brood, and skim and boomerang, through summer air, and reap mosquitoes from the hum of holidays, a handsome pair, one on the nest, one on the wire. Cheat, 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 the two conspire to murder half the insect race and feed them squirming to their chicks. They work and fret at such a pace, and natter in between. With clicks and churs, they lift the raftered place, seaside taverna, with their tricks of cursive loops and Morse code call, both analog and digital. They seem to us so coupled, married, so flustered with their needful young, so busy housekeeping, so harried. It's hard to picture them among the origins of myth, a buried secret, rape, a cut-out tongue, two sisters wronged when there's no right, till transformation fledges flight. But Ovid swapped them in the tale, so that the sister who was forced becomes instead the nightingale who sings as though her heart would burst. It's Ovid's stories that prevail, and thus the swallow is divorced twice from her voice, her tuneless chatter, and no one asks her what's the matter. These swallows, though, don't have the knack for sorrow, or we'd not have guessed. Though smartly dressed in tailored black, spend no time mourning, do not rest. One scissors forth, one zigzags back. They take turns settled on the nest, or waiting on a perch nearby to zero in on wasp or fly. They have no time for tragic song. As dusk distills, they dart and flicker. The days are long, but not as long as yesterday. The night comes quicker, and soon the season will be wrong. Knackered, cross, they bitch and bicker like you and me. They never learn, and every summer they return.
That's really great. That's really lovely. So let's finish with, it's 9:30. It feels like a sort of bed. Let's finish with, I just thought it would just be lovely to finish with a bedtime story. You were saying earlier on that, you don't make the distinction, and I think you're right, between fairy tale and Greek myth, and they're all part of the same world to be taken in the right spirit. So I just thought it would be lovely to end. I think it's the only villanelle I've seen you write. It's a villanelle, and it feels lovely to end with a bedtime story, doesn't it?
I think I do. I've written a few villanelles. They're very fun to write. They're not always fun to read, but I hope this one is both. And here there's a bit of a longer line. I often write in a iambic pentameter line. This is a little bit longer than that. And with a villanelle, you'll hear two rhyme sounds, and you'll hear certain lines repeat completely. Another bedtime story. One day you realize it. It doesn't need to be said. Just as you turn the page, the end, and close the cover, all of the stories are about going to bed. Goldilocks snug upstairs. The toothy wolf instead of grandmother tucked in the quilts, crooning closer, closer. One day you realize it. It hardly needs to be said. The snow-pale princess sleeps, the pillow under her head of rose petals or crystal, and dreams of a lost lover. All of the stories are about going to bed. Even the one about witches and ovens and gingerbread in the dark heart of Europe. Can children save each other? You start to doubt it a little. It doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it, because it's embedded in everything I've read. The tales that start with once and end with ever after. All of the stories are about going to bed, about coming to terms with the night, alleviating the dread of laying the body down, of lying under a cover. That's why our children resist it so. That's why it mustn't be said. All of the stories are about going to bed.
Thank you very much, Alicia. get copies of Like, I'd really, really recommend it. I don't need to recommend it because you've heard some of them. And unfortunately, we couldn't get Olive's as well. It's so difficult to get copies of Alicia's poems in England. Luckily, she's going to be publishing her selected poems with Carcanet in December, I think. Yeah, so you'll be able to get a selected. But and Alicia will be very, very happy to sign them outside, and we have a little gift for you as well.
Oh, God.